Isaiah chapter 9, famous words that are read this time of year. Nevertheless, there'll be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. It's God's word to us this morning. So one of my favorite services that we used to have in the church that I was part of in Basildon was the Christmas Eve communion service. Out of all the services that we did, this was my favorite one. There was something about it that whenever I led the service, I always used to use the illustration like we're standing in the eye of the storm. You know, when storms pass over, there's an eye, and there's it's chaos, and then there's a bit of calm in the middle, and then chaos again. And Christmas used to feel like that because all throughout November, December would be the preparation for Christmas. We used to send shoe boxes to Romania. I would often go on a mission trip to Romania during December, school assemblies, all these different things that we would do, or carol service and all age services. Everything was just running up, and then afterwards, after that moment of quiet in midnight Christmas Eve, there'd be the busyness of Christmas Day that awaits. The kind of cooking, the washing up, the time with family, the opening of presents, all these different sorts of things. But we used to gather together to share communion together, and it was like the eye of the storm, this moment of absolute calm, of real peace, where everything was done. And if it wasn't, it was too late to do it because nothing's going to be open on Christmas Day, right? So it's just, we'd come to this moment, and it'd be a sacred moment. We would sing carols together, we'd listen to words of Scripture together, we would pray together, and then around midnight, we would break bread together and share wine together and remember that Jesus had come to us, that he had died for us in order to redeem us and to bring us to God. And invariably, in that service, certainly if I was leading, the song that we would sing just before we shared communion would be Silent Night. Because there was something about it for me that would just convey the sense of gentleness, the sense of peace, the sense of wonder and awe about that evening, about what was kind of taking place in that evening. And if the history books are to be believed, and I think they've got it right because a couple of sources quote this, it was on an evening when things were quiet, when things were really still, when a guy by the name of Joseph Moore actually wrote Silent Night, or as it's known in the original language, Stille Nacht, which was in such sharp contrast to Joseph's life. Because he was born in 1792, in December 1792, into incredible poverty. His mother was an unmarried itinerant seamstress, so her job was to travel around towns knocking on people's door and say, have you got anything for me to sew and you can pay me for it? His father was a soldier who cleared off before he was even born. And so Joseph was born into this kind of poverty, and if you had taken a snapshot of his life just after he was born, December 1792, you would probably describe his life with things like got zero prospects. It's likely that his life will be brutal. It's likely that his life will be cruel. It's likely that his life will be very, very short, because that's how things went in those days. But he was rescued by the Catholic Church, and he was taken into the Catholic Church and given a first-class education through the Catholic Church. And they recognized in this young student, they recognized there's aptitude here, there's ability here. And so they fast-tracked him for the ministry. They fast-tracked him for the priesthood. And so by 24, he had been ordained as a priest, and he was given his first pastorate in a town called Oberndorf, which was perfectly suited to him, because Oberndorf was a town that had suffered greatly during the Napoleonic Wars. In the Treaty of Vienna, when they carved up the country and distributed, Oberndorf was separated from the main part of the town by a river, and so it was just sort of cut off from everything. They had no school, no church, and no cemetery. And Joseph was basically placed there as a newly ordained minister and said, crack on with it. And apparently one evening he was walking around Oberndorf on Christmas Eve, and he was struck by how winter-laden the town looked, about how at peace the town looked after all the ravages of war, and so the stillness that was sort of just kind of hanging on the town. And he was inspired in that moment, and he wrote Silent Night, Stille Nacht. A few months later, Franz Gruber took the lyrics, a friend of his took the lyrics that he had written, and he set it to music, and they performed it together for the first time in Oberndorf in the church in 1818, December 1818. And apparently Joseph Moore was strumming the guitar, and Franz was singing the music, and there just happened to be somebody who was there fixing the organ from another town who heard the music and asked for the sheet music, and then he carried the sheet music off to his town, where somebody else got a hold of it, and somebody else got a hold of it, and it just spread. It just spread hugely. In 1834, it was sung by the Stromer family in front of the King of Prussia. By 1839, it was sung on the steps of Trinity Church in New York City. And again, if history books are to be believed, then it was sung by English and German troops in blood-soaked trenches on Christmas Eve in 1914, leading towards the famous Christmas Day truce. And it makes sense, right? Because it's a beautiful song. I don't know if you felt it while we were singing it. There's something about Silent Night that just conveys this sense of stillness and beauty. It's one of these songs that we sing at Christmas time. And in a sense, it's Joseph Moore was standing in Oberndorf on this winter-laden evening, and he was looking back at all that God had done. And he captures this in the song. He captures about the Virgin Mary who's heavy with the Son of God. He sings about the shepherds who quake because there's an angel choir that is opened up before them, and who wouldn't, right? Singing this hallelujah chorus, and then the lyric that is probably one of my favorite in all Christmas carols: radiant beams thy holy face, beaming with the glory of God. Joseph standing in his time, looking back at all of God, at all that God has done. And in a sense, it's in sharp contrast to Isaiah chapter 9. Because what's happening in Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah isn't standing in the present looking back at what God has done. You've got to try to wrap your head around this with me a little bit. Isaiah is standing in the past, looking forward with future anticipation of a great light that is coming. And then he speaks about that future in the past tense as if it's already happened. Confused? It's okay if you are, right? Because so was I. I had to kind of in my mind. Here's how it's working. Isaiah's writing at about 733 BC, before Christ. Right? That's when he's writing. And God gives him prophetic insight and prophetic revelation of what he's going to do. So it's as if, not physically, but as if Isaiah is transported from 733 all the way over here on the timeline to AD 30, and he's looking at the life and ministry of Jesus. He's seeing what is happening and the impact that is happening, that it's going to have. And then he's going all the way back to 733 BC, okay? And he's writing about what he has seen in the past tense, because he's already seen it. In his mind, it's already happened. And he's making a declaration about this. And it's a word that the people I mean, it blesses us and it encourages us every year that we read it at Christmas time, right? But it's a word that the people at the time desperately needed to hear. 733 BC, 722 BC are key dates when the Assyrian army came in and conquered the northern kingdoms or the northern tribes of Israel. So if you know your Old Testament history, after King Solomon, the tribes, the nation split into northern kingdoms and southern kingdoms. In the south, you had Judah and Benjamin. In the north, you had the other 10 tribes. And the southern kingdom, they worshipped in Jerusalem. The others worshipped in Bethel. And God sent prophet after prophet after prophet to warn them to turn back to him. And they kept on saying, no, no, no. And eventually God said, fine. He lifted his hand of protection from them. And the Assyrian army came in and conquered them. And it was distress. And it was disaster, and it was humiliating, and in the sense, the brothers and sisters in the south, in Jerusalem, they're turning towards Isaiah the prophet who was based in Jerusalem. They're turning to him and they're saying, we need a word from you to make sense of what has just happened up in the north. We need you to give us some sort of prophetic insight into what is going on up in the north. I mean, how are we supposed to respond to the crisis, to the disaster, to the distress that it is that we are experiencing in this moment? And in response, God gives them, through the prophet Isaiah, this song or poem that we read at Christmas time. And in a sense, the poem holds both reality and a choice. In the poem, Isaiah is presenting to the people who are looking at him earnestly, saying, we need to try and make sense of what's going on up in the north. And Isaiah says, okay, so here's a poem that you can learn, and here's a poem you can take to heart, but it presents before you a reality and a choice. And the reality is the darkness, the distress, the humbling, it's very real. It's not imagined. It's not pretend. It's happening, and it's awful. That's the reality of your situation. There's no kind of gloss, there's no Photoshop, there's no airbrushing the situation. He's like, this is what it is. The people are living, and it feels like deep darkness. But then he says, you've got a choice. You can look at this and interpret what is happening up north in sense of the hopelessness of shattered dreams and the fact that God has forgotten you. You know, that's one choice about how you respond to this. You can throw up your hands and you can say, the dreams are ended, it's no good, what's the point? God has forgotten us. Oh, well, c'est la vie. You know, that's one choice that you can have to respond to the crisis. Or you can remember past mercies, stand on present promises, and then in light of that, make bold declarations about the future that God has for you. You've got a choice. You can throw your hands up in the air and say, it's no point, there's no use and everything, God's forgotten us. Or you can remember past mercies, and you can stand on present promises, and you can make bold declarations about the future, faithful declarations about the future that awaits. And my guess is when you look at that on the screen, most people in this room are thinking about occasions during the course of the year when you've had to do that again and again and again. Every time there's a challenge, every time there's a struggle, every time there's a difficulty, every time there's a hurdle, every time there's a mountain to be climbed, I think as followers of Jesus, we face this choice. What am I going to do? Throw my hands up in the air and say, God has forgotten me? Or am I going to choose to remember past mercies, remember his present promises, call to mind his present promises, and make bold declarations about the future? Maybe through the year you've felt the financial pinch. Your circumstances have changed for whatever reason, the rising cost of things. What do? You're going to throw your hands up in the air and say, God has forgotten me, my dreams are shattered? Or you're going to remember the way that he has provided for you in the past, he's promised to provide for you in the present, and then pray, God, give me daily bread. So all I'm asking for is daily bread. Maybe relationships are fraught and frazzled and so on. And what do? Throw your hands up in the air. It's no use. I'm just going to give up and just let it be kind of thing. Or Do we remember God's past mercies to give grace to us, to give wisdom to us, to give help to us, and stand on his present promises and then make bold declarations about the faith? God, you've given me wisdom in the past to navigate difficult things. I believe you'll give me wisdom now. Maybe you feel spiritually beat up, tempted on every side, and it feels like at the moment you're just stumbling at every hurdle, at every bit of temptation. What do? Throw our hands up in the air and say, God has forgotten us, he's not delivering us, I'm trying to put on the armor, but it's not working? Or do we remember the ways in which he's rescued us in the past, stand on his present promises to always provide a way out for us when we are tempted, to stand on his promise that he's faithful to forgive us when we've sinned and when we've gotten things wrong? And then make bold declarations by faith, saying that he who began a good work in me, he's going to carry it on to completion. He's going to do it. And Isaiah says, he's saying to the people that are looking at him, for advice, for a bit of direction, he's saying to them, listen, this is the reality and here's your choice. Throw your hands up in the air and say, God's forgotten you, or remember past mercies, stand on promises, make bold declarations of faith. And it's almost, I think, when Isaiah tells them this, it's almost as if he's hiding option A behind his back and saying to them, in reality, there's only one choice you can make. There's only one choice that you can make. And that is to make the right choice, right? Let's remember past mercies, stand on promises, future hope. And he presents it to them, not because he's a really positive guy, not because he's really charismatic, not because if you ask him, hey, is the glass half full, half empty, he's always going to say, oh no, definitely half full, Not because he's going to come up with clever remarks like, it will all be okay in the end, and if it's not okay, then it's not the end, just hold on, all this wishful thinking nonsense. No, he makes the bold declaration because of what it is that he has seen. Because of what it is he has seen. Which raises the question, so what did he see? The answer is light. Great light. Shining on those who were in darkness. And we've got to try to wrap our heads around how dark things were for the people. It was the nation, the northern tribes, they'd been obliterated. They'd been carried off into exile. Their homes were destroyed. Their livelihoods were destroyed. They were being carried away by people whose language they didn't understand and who were treating them incredibly cruelly, and they had no idea what the future held. When Isaiah says they're living in deep darkness and gloom, it's not an exaggeration, I think. I think it's the darkness that we sometimes feel that, I don't know if you've ever been in a place where it's really dark, where sometimes it feels like the darkness is so intense, it's as if somebody is taking their thumbs and pushing them into your eyes. I remember a friend of mine telling me about one of those canal boats that she went on, and as they were on the canal boat, they had to go through this tunnel. It's a famous tunnel, one of the longest ones, I think, in Britain. And she described how, as they went through this tunnel on this canal boat, her and her husband, she described how the light at the back got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it became a pinprick and then it disappeared. And so they couldn't see any light ahead of them, and they couldn't see any light behind them. At this point, they had the bright idea to turn the lights off. She said it was the most oppressive kind of darkness that she's ever felt. Gloomy, heavy, weighty, suffocating. It's like something on your chest that's just pressing the air out of your lungs so that you can't breathe. This is the kind of darkness that the people were experiencing. And they were going to sleep with it at night, and they're waking up with it every single morning. And Isaiah says, on these people, light. Light dawns and light is seen. They're two really, really important words, right? Because the first one, light dawns, points to the fact that this is God's doing. All right, he's making, in the same way that God has said, let there be light, and light appeared in the sky in the Genesis narrative, right? In the same way that God put the sun in the sky to rise every day on a 24-hour cycle, in the same way that God has done that, now he's doing something supernatural, and those that are walking in darkness, God is going to bring light to them, and it's going to shine brightly. It's going to illuminate their steps, and the people are going to see it. They're going to get to see this great light. I don't know if you were ever scared of the dark when you were growing up. Do you remember lying in bed sometimes, staring at the shadows, at the curtain, thinking, is that a monster? What was that noise in the cupboard? Hang on a second, I don't think anybody checked underneath the bed. And as you think about these things, there's a growing sense of fear and anxiety until you shout out, Mom, Dad, and they come in and they turn on the light and everything is okay. In just an instant, everything is. That's what Isaiah is saying here. Saying that light is coming, and because there's light, there's going to be increase. It's what happens in the next few verses. I didn't make note of which verse it is, but because there is this great light that comes, now there is going to be increase. The nation's experience so far has been decrease. The 10 tribes in the north, they've been shrinking. Their army has shrunk, their power has shrunk, their influence has shrunk, their resources has shrunk, their gross domestic product has probably shrunk, their borders have shrunk. But now the tide's going to move the other way. Now there's going to be increase. Because this light has come, there is going to be increase in the nation. And Isaiah uses two metaphors, a military one and an agricultural one, but it's the agricultural one that I like. He says it's going to be like the harvest. Do you know what it's like at harvest time? When you go out and you bring in the corn and that sort of thing, it just results in great joy. Now, this doesn't resonate with us because we go to Tesco's, right? And we get excited, great joy if it's like on markdown price and that sort of thing. But if you've ever planted stuff, vegetables, you will know there's a joy at harvest time. I remember I used to, for a couple of years, I planted lots of different things. We had cherry tomatoes and lettuce and runner beans, carrots I think we had one year, but the potatoes were my favorite. Because potatoes are a curious thing to plant. You take potatoes and you put them in the ground and you cover it up, and that's it. At least with a cherry tomato, you can see it grow, right? Or beans, you can see them grow. With potatoes, you're just like, I hope there's something happening underneath there. And then the plant grows up on the top, and you get these little white and yellow flowers, and then that dies, and then when that dies, it's like ready to go to harvest time. And I remember the one year that we planted potatoes. It was a Saturday when we harvested the potatoes. I think, if memory serves me correctly, we were having burgers for dinner, and we needed potatoes for chips. So the boys and I went to go and harvest the potatoes, and I had these big planters. And first, we had to get rid of all the cat poo that was in there, really annoying. But then we got our hands into the planters, and we lifted our hands up through the soil. And as we lifted our hands up through the soil, one by one, you saw these beautiful little spuds coming to the surface. And my son is smiling at me now because he knows and I know there were grins from ear to ear. It was like, it worked. You know, this is amazing. And we're like, wow, that's a really, really big one. And I found a small one over here. And we were just pulling them out. And chips have never tasted so good. But this is what happens, right? When there's increase, there is joy. If you get a Christmas bonus, come on, there's going to be joy, right? Yeah? Oh, your boss says to you, next year, we're going to bump your salary a little bit. What are you going to do? You're going to be walking out the office. Dun, 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 dun. It's going to be, because when there's increase, there is joy. It's the same thing that's captured in Psalm 126 when the psalmist looking at God and saying, God, restore our fortunes. God, you've got to do something. You've got to restore our fortunes. And then a few lines down, he says, the people go out and they're sowing seed, and there are tears that are running down their cheeks as they put seed into the ground. But then they say, but when we came back, we had sheaves of wheat and our mouths were filled with laughter. The people are going to rejoice because light is going to come and there's going to be increase. And what I love is that Isaiah makes it clear throughout this poem that it's not going to be because of anything that they have done. It's not because they're going to strategy their way out of it. No, it's all going to be God. He's the one that brings the light. He's the one that brings the increase. And around verse 4, 5, Isaiah begins to allude back to God's past mercies. And said, God has brought light in the past, and he has brought increase in the past, and so we're praying today, God, in the present, do it again. The nation of Israel were nothing. They were nobodies. They were captive in Egypt, suffering under oppression and slavery with a yoke of oppression over them, right? Shoulders bruised and broken. And what did God do? With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he took a hold of his people and he made them his very own. And he brought them out of a very, very dark place into his light, into a place where they could increase and they could fill the space that he had provided for them. And Isaiah is saying, God, you've done it, past mercies. You've done it in the past, God. You need to do it again. He refers to Midian, which is pointing towards the judges. Remember the story of Gideon standing in the winepress threshing corn, right? Because they're scared that the Midianites are going to come and steal their packed lunch. And God gets a hold of Gideon and he puts him in charge of a small army of 300, and then God goes before them to fight on behalf of them. Dark times that they were enduring, but God takes them by the scruff of the neck and he brings them into freedom and he brings them to a place of increase. And Isaiah is saying, hey, listen, God, do it again. Or actually, more importantly, he's probably saying to the people, God is going to do it again. Where he's encouraging them to remember past mercies, he's saying to them, listen, God is going to do this again. To which the people would have chorused and they would have said, how? How is it exactly that God is going to do this again? The answer, verse 6, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. When those words were spoken, it wasn't long after that Hezekiah came to reign and rule in Jerusalem. And many people thought, he's the one. He's the child that the prophet spoke about. And it kind of makes sense, and some scholars still claim that today. It kind of makes sense because Hezekiah brought in a time of freedom. He brought in a time of restoration for the people and brought about change and reform. But he wasn't the one. He wasn't the one because his throne was not fully established on justice. It was not fully established on righteousness. It didn't endure forever. It might have pointed to him in a fraction, but really it was pointing forward to the Messiah. It was pointing forward to Jesus. He is the Son, the child that is born of the Virgin Mary, conceived by the Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary, human parentage. He is the Son that is given, a divine gift of God given to the people of God. He is the one on whose shoulders the authority hangs and the one who has the burden of authority. It all points to Jesus. And the names that then follow, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Again, all of these, they point to Jesus. Whether it's in his life or in his death and resurrection, he's the one that perfectly fulfills all of them. You think about Jesus as the wonderful counselor. There is no one whose words have had as much impact in history as the words of Jesus. It has literally shaped nations. It has literally shaped the culture that we are a part of. I read a book recently called The Air We Breathe, where the author makes the argument, and he says, the air that we breathe is Christian because of the work and words of Jesus Christ, the wisest person ever to have lived. He is mighty God, the one who walks on water, who calms the storm, who opens blind eyes, who raises the dead to life, who sets people in their right mind, and all with a word and all with a touch. He's everlasting Father. Isaiah's not saying that he is the Father. He's saying that he is Father-like. He's the exact representation of the Father's being. He says, I can only do what I see the Father doing, and I can only say what I hear the Father saying. So he perfectly represents the Father to us, and he is the Prince of Peace. Wherever he walked, whoever he encountered, he set them at peace. And that's just his life. When you point towards, when you take these names and you hold them up against the death and resurrection of Jesus, they hold perfectly. He's the wonderful counselor, the one that reveals. Paul says that God has kept mysteries hidden for ages past, but now they've been revealed in the work and person of Jesus, in his death and resurrection. That through Christ and in Christ, God is redeeming the whole world to himself. People will be looking at God, how can we be saved? How can we be rescued? And God says, I've got a plan, and his name is Jesus. And he's going to do it. At the cross, we see Jesus, who is mighty God, the only one who is able to bear your sin and to bear my sin. All the sin of humankind, past, present, and future, is placed upon the shoulders, placed upon Jesus on the cross, so that we don't have to. And he drinks down the wrath of God to its very, very end. He is mighty God. He is everlasting Father, the one that through the cross reconciles us to God, makes a new covenant written in his blood in order to bring us to God, that we can look at God and call him Father, that we can declare that we're children of God. He's the Prince of Peace, who through his blood shed on the cross makes peace between us and God. So we can have our conscience cleansed. We can walk in this world with our head held high. And because we've got peace with God, we now have peace within ourselves, right? We're no longer scrambling, trying to prove ourselves to everybody. No. We're okay with our identity being based on who God has said we are and who he is. No more scrabbling around, because we're at rest with this. And because we have peace with God and we have peace within ourselves, we now pursue peace with other people as well. It's far-reaching. And I love that Isaiah goes on from mentioning these different names, and he says, this child is born, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and his peace, there will be no end. And if you look at the trajectory of history, that has been true every single decade, every single century. The Church of Jesus Christ that began on the day of Pentecost has only ever been in increase. The line goes up. People say, oh, but the church is declining in the West. Maybe. But it's expanding across the whole world. When you look at the big picture, it's expanding across the whole world. I remember one author saying that there's 3 times in history where the church has gone to the dogs, and each time the dogs lost. There are seasons in church history where the tide may pull back a little bit in the life of the church, but when the tide comes in, God is in the habit of renewing his people. He's in the habit of restoring his people, as he was communicating to Isaiah. So when the tide comes in again, it always moves further up the beach. There's always increase that has come, because this is how the kingdom of God works. And so Isaiah says to the people, look, you've got a choice. This is what it looks like. This is the reality. Here's your choice. Throw your hands up in the air and say that God has forgotten you, or remember his past mercies, stand on his current promises, and start to make bold declarations about the faith, about your faith, and about what God can do. And it's the choice that we face today. It's the choice that we will face again and again in a whole lot of different circumstances, in a whole lot of different ways. And I can tell you from experience that if we make the choice of the latter, remembering past mercies, present promises, future declarations, if we do that, it'll do something to you. It'll lead you to peace. Shalom, right? Which is not the absence of trouble, and it's not the absence of difficulty, but it is the presence of Almighty God with you in the midst of those things. Knowing the presence of the Wonderful Counselor with you, knowing the presence of Mighty God with you, knowing the presence of the Everlasting Father with you, knowing the presence of the Prince of Peace with you. And it will enable you to look at life and just to be real. And yes, we're still sinners. Yes, we still need grace. Yes, we still need pruning. Yes, we still need disciplining. But God has done something about it. And he's made us his very own. And he's gracious towards us. So in the mess, we can still have peace. A peace that is just real. The fullness of justice and righteousness, we'll never see that this side of glory. But every time somebody bends the knee and puts their trust in Jesus Christ, the increase of his government continues and his peace continues. And so righteousness rolls on and justice like a never-ending stream. One life at a time, one heart at a time. We can know peace in some of the darkest times and look at it and face it with faith and pray, God, let your light shine. Let your light shine. In our government, Lord, let your light shine. In our community, God, let your light shine. In your church, God, let your light shine. In the broken places of this world, God, let your light shine. Bring your light, God. I don't know about you, but I just think it's much better to remember past mercies, present promises, and therefore hold on to future hope, than to throw our hands up in the air and say, God's forgotten me. I wonder what you will choose.